of shoes. She's just out of prison and
plans?
going shopping. It's the first video of Gypsy Rose Blanchard with her husband after she was released from prison in the pre-dawn hours today.
Do you have any plans?
Lots of. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was a victim of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition in which a parent fakes or exaggerates a child's illness to get attention. In Gypsy Rose's case, her disturbed mother tried to convince everyone the girl suffered from leukemia and muscular dystrophy. Fed up with years of unnecessary medical treatment, Gypsy Rose got her then-boyfriend to stab her mother 17 times. They later posted a Facebook message saying that blank is dead. The boyfriend, Nicholas Godejohn, got life. Gypsy Rose got 10 years. Now 32, Gypsy Rose was picked up by her husband in a Cadillac when she was released from a prison in Missouri at 3:20 a.m. A few hours later came the couple's hand-in-hand trip to the shoe store. The Gypsy Rose Blanchard case has been featured several times on TV. Actress Patricia Arquette played the mom in a 2019 Hulu limited series.
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all?
You are.
No, you.
I heard her scream once, and there was more screaming, but not like the kind in a horror film, just like a startled scream. And she asked, who was it that was in the bedroom? And she called out to my name about 3 or 4 times. And at that point, I wanted to go help her so bad, but I was so afraid to get up. It's like my body wouldn't move, and then everything just went quiet.
Were you excited that your new life was about to begin?
I was excited, but at the same time it was overwhelming.
Did you feel a rush of joy?
It would come in times of happiness, little spurts of happiness, but I would have breakdowns where I'd start crying, feeling remorse, guilt, also missing her at the same time.
There are stories where violence announces itself, where something breaks loudly, suddenly, unmistakably. And then there are stories like this one, where nothing seems broken at all, where silence does most of the work, where routines continue, where appearances remain intact, where smiles are practiced, where medical charts stack neatly in folders, where charity events are attended, where neighbors wave, where photographs show a young girl in a wheelchair, smiling beside a mother who never leaves her side. In those stories, the danger is not in what is seen. It is in what is never questioned. For years, people looked at Gypsy Rose Blanchard and saw a child who could not walk, a child who could not eat without assistance, a child who suffered from seizures, leukemia, muscular dystrophy, asthma, and developmental delays, a child whose life, according to every story told, was defined by illness. But what no one saw, what almost no one imagined, was that beneath that carefully curated narrative, there was another reality, one built not on sickness, but on control, not on fragility, but on confinement, not on care, but on possession. This is not just a story about a murder. It is a story about a life shaped so completely by deception that escape itself became unrecognizable. It is a story where survival and violence blurred into something almost indistinguishable, and it is a story where the absence of truth was as powerful as any weapon. Before we continue, welcome to Cold Case Chronicles, where we look for the truth in the shadows of cold cases and closed files. If you value this kind of deep dive investigation, please consider subscribing. And as we begin this journey together, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Whether you're joining us from the United States, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world, leave a comment below. It helps us remember that these stories, though local, touch hearts across the globe. Now let's begin. Long before there were police reports, long before there were interrogations, long before there was a body discovered in a small pink house in Springfield, Missouri, there was a mother and a daughter who appeared inseparable. Claudine Dee Blanchard presented herself as devoted, tireless, self-sacrificing. The kind of mother people admire, the kind of mother people praise, the kind of mother people never suspect. She spoke for Gypsy. She answered for Gypsy. She filled out medical forms. She explained symptoms. She carried records. She corrected doctors. She managed appointments. She organized care. To the outside world, Dee was a guardian. To Gypsy, she was a gatekeeper. From early childhood, Gypsy's life was structured around illness, hospital visits, surgeries, feeding tubes, wheelchairs, medications, specialists, charts, diagnoses that accumulated faster than they could be verified. Gypsy learned early that pain brought attention, that weakness brought approval, that compliance brought peace. She learned that disagreement brought consequences. She learned that questions were dangerous. She learned that independence was not an option. And perhaps most critically, she learned that her body did not belong to her. Neighbors saw a sick child. Doctors saw a complex case. Charities saw a family in need. The community saw a mother who never gave up. What no one saw clearly was the invisible architecture of control. Because control does not always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like protection, sometimes it looks like sacrifice, sometimes it looks like love. Dee controlled the narrative of Gypsy's body. She controlled what Gypsy ate, what Gypsy said, what Gypsy knew about her own health, even what Gypsy believed about her own age. Medical records were inconsistent. Birth dates shifted. Histories were rewritten. Symptoms were exaggerated or invented. But the system, designed to trust caregivers, did what it often does. It deferred. Over time, Gypsy's identity became inseparable from illness. She was introduced as fragile, treated as fragile, handled as fragile, spoken to as fragile. She was not allowed to grow up in the way other children do. Her world was small. Her boundaries were tighter. Her voice was quieter. If Gypsy asked too many questions, she was told she didn't understand. If she showed too much strength, it was dismissed. If she tried to assert herself, she was corrected. The message was constant, even when it was unspoken. You cannot survive without me. And for a long time, Gypsy believed it. The house they lived in became a symbol, built with help from charities, designed to accommodate a child with special needs. Wide doorways, ramps, accessible bathrooms, everything built around the idea that Gypsy would never walk freely. The house itself reinforced the story, physical proof of a narrative no one questioned. And yet, beneath that story, something else was growing. Because bodies remember what minds are not allowed to say. And Gypsy's body knew things her life was not allowed to acknowledge. She could walk. She could eat normally. She could think clearly. She could understand more than she was permitted to express. But each of those truths had to be hidden. Because in that home, truth was dangerous. As Gypsy entered her teenage years, the gap between what she felt and what she was told widened. She noticed inconsistencies. She overheard fragments. She felt strength in her legs. She recognized that some medications made her worse, not better. But she also learned fear. Dee's control was not loud. It was firm. It was absolute. It was enforced through authority, manipulation, and emotional dependency. When Gypsy tried to assert independence, Dee reminded her of her illnesses. When Gypsy questioned treatments, Dee reminded her of her weakness. When Gypsy imagined a future, Dee narrowed it. The outside world reinforced it all. Doctors deferred to Dee's history. Neighbors praised her devotion. Organizations gave financial support. News stories framed her as a heroic caregiver. The system rewarded the story, and Gypsy learned that her survival depended on playing her role. But adolescence brought something Dee could not fully control. Curiosity. Through limited internet access, through secret conversations, through small digital windows into a larger world, Gypsy saw something unfamiliar. Normal life, autonomy, choice, romantic connection. And with that exposure came a realization that would quietly change everything. The world was bigger than her bedroom. She began to understand that other girls her age had privacy, that they made decisions, that they were allowed to grow, and that knowledge was dangerous. Because once a person understands they are being confined, confinement becomes unbearable. Gypsy's relationship with her mother shifted in ways that were subtle on the surface but profound underneath. Conversations became shorter. Compliance became mechanical. Emotion became guarded. Silence grew heavier. Dee Dee continued to manage appearances, continued to tell the story, continued to schedule appointments, continued to present herself as the devoted mother of a severely ill child. But Gypsy was changing internally. She began to imagine a life that did not include wheelchairs, a life that did not include feeding tubes, a life where her body belonged to her. These were not fantasies of wealth or fame. They were fantasies of normalcy, of walking outside alone, of eating what she wanted, of choosing who she spoke to, of being seen as a person rather than a patient. And in that space between fantasy and reality, something else entered: connection. Online, Gypsy met people who did not see her through medical charts. They did not define her by diagnoses. They spoke to her as a person. They flirted. They joked. They treated her like someone with agency. For someone who had lived her entire life under supervision, that attention was powerful. Not because it was perfect, not because it was healthy, but because it was different. It represented an alternate emotional world, one where Gypsy was not owned, one where she was chosen, one where she could imagine escape. And escape, once imagined, is difficult to unimagine. But imagination alone was not enough, because Dee Dee was still there, still controlling, still speaking for her, still managing every detail, still presenting a version of Gypsy that did not allow for growth. The weight of that reality pressed down on Gypsy's internal world. Every day became a negotiation between who she was told she was and who she felt herself becoming. That kind of psychological pressure does not explode. It compresses. It tightens. It reshapes perception. It teaches a person that conventional solutions are not available, that asking for help is dangerous, that obedience is safer than resistance, that silence is survival, and when silence becomes survival, desperation becomes rational. Gypsy did not wake up one day wanting violence. She woke up in a life where escape did not seem possible by any ordinary means. In that kind of environment, fantasy does not stay fantasy for long. It becomes a plan. And plans, when they grow in isolation, do not develop the same moral boundaries as plans developed in open, supported spaces. The person Gypsy connected with online, Nicholas Godejohn, represented something specific, not just romance, not just attention, but a doorway, a way out, not through negotiation, not through legal channels, not through therapy or social services, but through disappearance. In the psychological world Gypsy inhabited, disappearance felt like the only available form of freedom, because her entire life had taught her that authority could not be challenged, that institutions trusted her mother, that her voice carried no weight, that escape was not allowed. When a system traps someone long enough, they stop imagining solutions that require that system's cooperation. They imagine exits, not conversations, not disclosures, not interventions, exits. The tragedy of this case is not only in what happened, it is in how limited Gypsy's perceived options had become. Because perception shapes action, and when perception is formed in captivity, the range of acceptable choices narrows to survival at any cost. By the time the plan began to form, Gypsy's internal world had already been transformed by years of control, medicalization, and isolation. She did not see herself as someone who could simply leave. She saw herself as someone who could only be removed. That distinction matters, because it reframes what followed not as impulsive violence, but as a distorted form of escape planning. This does not justify what happened, but it does explain how someone could come to believe that it was necessary. When Nicholas traveled to Missouri, the story crossed from fantasy into reality. But even then, it did not feel real to Gypsy in the way ordinary crimes feel real. Her emotional development had been shaped by secrecy, by role-playing, by pretending, by existing in worlds where truth was flexible. In that environment, the difference between imagined escape and real-world consequence becomes blurred. The house still stood. The routine still existed. Dee Dee still controlled the narrative. But beneath the surface, the story had already changed. Because Gypsy no longer believed in rescue. She believed only in removal. And in that belief, the line between survival and violence dissolved. What happened next would shock the country. It would divide public opinion. It would raise questions that still have no clean answers. Was Gypsy a victim? Was she a participant? Was she both? Those questions remain because the truth exists in the uncomfortable space between trauma and responsibility. And it is in that space, not in headlines, not in verdicts, where the real story lives. In the next phase of this narrative, the investigation will begin to peel back the layers of performance, deception, and psychological captivity that shaped every decision. Because when the truth finally emerged, it would not arrive as a single revelation. It would arrive as a collapse of stories, of assumptions, of the image everyone had trusted for years. And when that collapse came, it would force a nation to confront a terrifying possibility that sometimes the most dangerous prisons are the ones that look like care. There were years when nothing appeared to change. From the outside, the Blanchard home seemed frozen in time. A young girl in a wheelchair, a devoted mother at her side, a life organized around illness schedules, hospital visits, charity events, and public gratitude. The story was consistent. The details never shifted. Gypsy Rose was always fragile. Dee Dee was always tireless. The roles were so well rehearsed that even professionals learned not to question them. But beneath that stillness, something was quietly moving. Gypsy's body did not behave like a terminal patient's body. She grew taller. She retained strength. She could walk when no one was watching. Her teeth, removed for reasons that were never medically necessary, left her face altered in ways she could not explain to herself. Her feeding tube became part of her identity before she was old enough to understand what identity meant. The message she absorbed was simple and relentless. Your body is not yours. Your story is not yours. Your life belongs to the narrative your mother tells. Control did not announce itself as cruelty. It arrived as care. Dee Dee spoke for Gypsy in doctors' offices. She answered questions before they were fully asked. She corrected Gypsy's words gently, almost kindly, when Gypsy described symptoms that did not fit the script. Over time, Gypsy learned that accuracy was dangerous. Agreement was safer. What the outside world saw as devotion, Gypsy experienced as containment. Her education was limited. Her social circle was nearly non-existent. When she asked about her age, Dee Dee gave different answers to different people, sometimes even to Gypsy herself. Birth certificates were hidden. Medical records were controlled. Reality became flexible. Truth became conditional. In this environment, independence was not just discouraged, it was treated as a threat. Gypsy learned to smile on command. She learned how to perform illness. She learned which answers earned praise and which earned silence. And silence in that house was heavier than anger. There were moments, small, fleeting, when Gypsy tested the boundaries. A question asked too directly, a glance held too long, a moment of standing when she believed she was alone. Each time, Dee Dee responded not with overt violence, but with tightening control. More medications, more supervision, less privacy. The system rewarded Dee Dee for this. Doctors trusted her. Charities supported her. Community members praised her strength. Free trips, free housing, free support flowed toward the family. The narrative was too powerful, too emotionally compelling to challenge. A sick child and a heroic mother fit a story people wanted to believe. No one wanted to be the person who accused a caregiver of inventing suffering, and so the structure held. Gypsy grew older, but her life did not expand with her age. Developmentally, she was frozen in the role of a child patient. Emotionally, she was isolated from peers, relationships, and the quiet learning that comes from ordinary mistakes. Her world was narrow, and within narrow worlds, fantasy grows easily. It began with a computer. Online, Gypsy could type without being corrected. She could choose her words. She could present herself without a wheelchair, without a feeding tube, without the medical narrative that followed her everywhere in the physical world. For the first time, she could be unseen and, therefore, uncontrolled. She created accounts. She explored social platforms. She found chat rooms and message boards. She learned how to speak to strangers as a person rather than as a patient. This was not rebellion. It was oxygen. In those digital spaces, Gypsy discovered a version of herself that had never been allowed to exist. Curious, romantic, lonely, hopeful, naive, human. She also discovered how vulnerable that made her. The relationships she formed were intense, fast, emotionally charged. She did not have the tools to pace connection. She had never learned what healthy boundaries looked like. Every new bond felt like escape. Every message felt like proof that another life was possible. And then, she met Nicholas Godejohn. He did not arrive as a villain. He arrived as someone who listened. Nicholas lived in Wisconsin. He had his own history of isolation, developmental challenges, and emotional instability. Online, he found in Gypsy someone who understood loneliness in a way few others could. Their conversations grew frequent, personal, confessional. They spoke about fear, about being misunderstood, about wanting to be loved without conditions. For Gypsy, Nicholas represented something more than a person. He represented exit, not from her house, from her identity. The fantasy life began to form quietly, in messages and imagined futures, a world where Gypsy was not sick, where she could walk freely, where she could make choices without asking permission. The weight of her real life made the fantasy feel light by comparison. But fantasy does not remain harmless when reality feels inescapable. As the relationship deepened, Gypsy's internal conflict sharpened. She was discovering truth about her health, about her age, about the lies that had shaped her childhood. With each discovery, the contradiction between who she was and who she was forced to be grew more painful. Confrontation was not an option. Dee Dee's control was not just emotional. It was practical. She controlled transportation, money, documents, access to the outside world. Gypsy could not simply leave. She had no proof of who she was, no financial independence, no physical means to escape unnoticed. And more importantly, she had been taught to believe that without Dee Dee, she would die. Even as she began to suspect that this was untrue, the psychological imprint remained. Dependency is not erased by knowledge alone. It is erased by safety. And safety did not exist in her world. In this environment, the idea of outside intervention became both necessary and terrifying. Nicholas became more than a boyfriend. He became a solution, not a good one. But in Gypsy's constrained mental framework, he represented action in a life where she had never been allowed to act. The conversations changed tone. They moved from fantasy to planning, not immediately, not directly. First, they spoke about running away, about meeting, about being together somewhere else. But each option collapsed under practical reality. Gypsy could not leave without being tracked. Dee Dee would report her missing. Authorities would return her. The medical narrative would follow her. The cage was not just the house. It was the story. And then, gradually, another possibility entered the conversation. Not framed as murder, framed as freedom. The idea was not born from rage. It did not emerge from a sudden fight. It grew in the quiet, dark space where options felt exhausted, where desperation had nowhere to go but inward. This is where the psychological weight of the case becomes difficult to hold. Gypsy was a victim of long-term systemic abuse. That is not in dispute. Medical manipulation, emotional control, isolation, identity erasure. These are recognized forms of profound trauma. But trauma does not erase responsibility, and responsibility does not erase trauma. The plan that formed between Gypsy and Nicholas was not impulsive. It was discussed, revisited, adjusted. It was treated as a way out rather than what it was, a decision to end a life. In Gypsy's internal world, Dee Dee was not only her mother, she was her jailer. In Nicholas's internal world, he was becoming something else. Not just a boyfriend, a rescuer, a protector, a figure who could perform an act that Gypsy felt psychologically incapable of performing herself. Control, once held by Dee Dee, began to shift, not to Gypsy, but to the fantasy of escape. When Nicholas traveled to Missouri in June 2015, the movement of the story crossed from psychological to physical. The internet became a location. Messages became presence. Fantasy entered the real world. What followed was not chaotic. It was contained, quiet, planned. The house that had been a stage for illness became the setting for something else entirely. Afterward, there was no dramatic escape, no immediate freedom. There was shock, confusion, poorly thought-out attempts to create distance, online messages posted to draw attention, a narrative that collapsed under its own weight. When Dee Dee's body was discovered, the community did not first think of Gypsy as a suspect. They thought of her as missing. They thought of her as endangered. They thought of her as a victim of kidnapping or violence, because that was the story they had been taught to believe. And for a moment, the story held, until it didn't. The discovery that Gypsy could walk was not just a physical revelation. It was a narrative rupture. It forced law enforcement, media, and the public to confront something deeply uncomfortable. That the child they had seen as helpless was also capable of participating in something terrible. That the mother they had praised as heroic had been abusive. That the line between victim and offender was not clean. The investigation unfolded with procedural calm. Interviews, digital evidence, travel records, message histories. The fantasy world was printed out, line by line, stripped of its emotional framing, and placed into legal context. What sounded like escape in private messages read like conspiracy in court documents. Nicholas confessed. Gypsy spoke. Their versions overlapped and diverged. What became clear was not just what happened, but how it had been decided. This was not a loss of control. It was the pursuit of control. Control over a life that had never belonged to Gypsy. Control over a future that felt otherwise unreachable. In court, experts spoke about abuse, about psychological imprisonment, about the long-term effects of coercive control. The system acknowledged what Dee Dee had done, but the system also acknowledged what Gypsy and Nicholas had done. Two truths, held at once. Gypsy accepted a plea deal. 10 years. A sentence that reflected both victimization and culpability. Nicholas received life. Two people shaped by isolation, fantasy, and emotional dependency, now separated permanently by the very act that had bound them together. For Gypsy, prison became, paradoxically, the first place where she had some measure of autonomy, structure without maternal control, rules that applied evenly, a system that did not pretend her illness defined her. It was not freedom, but it was different. Over time, Gypsy's public image shifted again. From sick child, to abused daughter, to convicted participant, to media figure, interviews, documentaries, public debates, supporters, critics. But beneath all of it, the core truth remained unchanged. A child was raised inside a fiction so complete that reality became unreachable. And when reality could not be reached, fantasy became a substitute. Fantasy became a solution, and a solution became a crime. This is what makes the case linger. Not because it is shocking, but because it is slow. Slow to form, slow to unravel, slow to explain, slow to emotionally resolve. It forces an uncomfortable recognition that some crimes are not explosions. They are exits. After the sentence was handed down, the story did not end. It changed shape. The courtroom had provided a framework, charges, pleas, years assigned to actions. But it could not resolve the deeper psychological questions that lingered beneath the surface. It could not restore the years Gypsy had lived inside a manufactured identity. It could not fully separate victimhood from agency. It could only define responsibility in legal terms. Inside prison, Gypsy entered a world that was, in its own way, more honest than the one she had left. There were no charity events, no costumes of illness, no scripted performances. There were rules, schedules, and a social order that did not revolve around her medical narrative. For the first time, she was not rewarded for appearing weak. She was required to function. That transition was not simple. People raised under total control do not automatically understand autonomy. Choice can feel like danger. Independence can feel like abandonment. Even small freedoms can trigger anxiety rather than relief. Gypsy had to learn how to exist without someone telling her who she was. She had to learn how to answer questions without checking whether her answer fit a story. She had to learn how to feel anger, not as a threat to survival, but as an emotion that could be named and contained. This kind of psychological rebuilding is slow. It does not follow sentencing timelines. It does not fit neatly into rehabilitation narratives. And it does not erase what happened. Public fascination with the case grew rather than faded. Documentaries, dramatizations, interviews, and social media debates kept the story alive in a way few criminal cases experience. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: abuse, deception, culpability, tragedy. Gypsy became, in the public imagination, more than a person. She became a symbol. For some, she symbolized survival. For others, manipulation. For others still, a cautionary tale about unchecked caregiving and institutional blind spots. But symbols flatten complexity. They cannot hold contradiction. Real lives do. What often went missing in public discourse was the slow, invisible damage caused by years of identity erasure. When a child is taught that their body is broken, that their mind is limited, that their future is not theirs to design, something fundamental is altered. Trust in self, trust in perception, trust in reality. By the time Gypsy began to understand that she had been lied to, the structure of her thinking had already been shaped by dependence. Escape, in her mind, did not look like calling for help. It did not look like legal intervention. It looked like removal of the obstacle, not because she was inherently violent, but because violence was the only exit she could imagine. That does not justify it, but it explains how the logic formed. This is where the system also enters the story. Medical professionals, social workers, educators, and community members encountered the Blanchards over many years. Pieces of the story were present. Inconsistencies existed. Questions were raised occasionally. But the narrative was emotionally powerful. A suffering child and a devoted mother. To challenge that narrative required not just evidence, but emotional courage. It required risking being wrong in public. It required the willingness to be seen as cruel, suspicious, or unsympathetic. The cost of silence, however, was higher. It was paid by Gypsy's body, by her development, by her identity, and ultimately, by Dee life. This is not a story of a single failure. It is a story of accumulated failures. Small moments where someone could have asked a harder question. Small moments where a file could have been reviewed more carefully. Small moments where a narrative could have been interrupted. Each moment, insignificant on its own. Together, catastrophic. Nicholas Godejohn's role is often reduced to a single act, but his psychological landscape matters too. He was not a mastermind. He was not a professional criminal. He was a deeply isolated individual with cognitive and emotional limitations, drawn into a relationship that gave him a sense of purpose and identity. In their private messages, he did not sound like someone planning a murder for pleasure. He sounded like someone trying to become a version of himself that mattered. A protector, a hero, a necessary figure. In his mind, the act was framed as sacrifice, as proof of love, as something that would finally give his life meaning. This is one of the most dangerous distortions of fantasy, when imagined roles replace moral reality. In fantasy, the rescuer is always justified. In reality, the rescuer becomes a killer. The law does not operate on fantasy. It operates on outcomes. And the outcome was final. As years passed, Gypsy's case continued to evolve in public consciousness. Her parole, her interviews, her attempts to build a life outside the shadow of the crime. Each step reignited debate. Could someone be both deeply abused and deeply responsible? Could survival instincts become criminal instincts? Could a person be shaped so profoundly by control that they could not imagine nonviolent escape? These are not comfortable questions. They are not easily answered. But they are necessary. Because the danger in this case is not that it is unique. The danger is that it is not. Coercive control, medical abuse, identity manipulation, emotional imprisonment. These exist in quieter forms, in less visible households, in narratives that look loving on the surface. Most do not end in murder, but many end in damage that is harder to measure. What makes the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case linger is not just what happened. It is what it reveals about how stories can become cages, how sympathy can become cover, how protection can become possession, how silence can be mistaken for safety, and how, when a person grows up without agency, the moment they seek it can be catastrophically misdirected. In the end, the crime was decided, long before the night it occurred. It was decided in years of controlled narratives, in years of unanswered questions, in years of performance rewarded and doubt discouraged. By the time action was taken, the options felt narrow, not because they truly were, but because the psychological walls were already built. This is not a story about a sick girl. It is a story about a girl who was told she was sick until she believed her life depended on it. This is not a story about a sudden act of violence. It is a story about a slow construction of inevitability. And this is not a story with a clean moral ending. It is a story that forces us to sit with discomfort. That explanation does not equal justification. That victimhood does not erase harm. That harm does not erase victimhood. And that some crimes are not born from rage. They are born from silence, from fantasy, from the belief that the only way out is through something irreversible. Gypsy Rose Blanchard now exists in a world where her name is permanently attached to a narrative she did not fully choose, and yet helped shape. She carries both the weight of what was done to her and what she participated in doing. The story does not resolve neatly. It lingers, not because it is unresolved, but because it asks questions that have no simple answers, and perhaps that is its most disturbing legacy. That understanding does not bring comfort, only clarity. There is a temptation, in cases like this, to search for a single moment that explains everything. A diagnosis, a confrontation, a discovery, a decision. But this case resists that kind of simplicity. What happened to Gypsy Rose Blanchard was not the result of one abusive act. It was the result of a system of control that became normalized through repetition. The extraordinary became routine. The implausible became accepted. Over time, even truth lost its authority. When a child grows up inside a story that is not their own, they do not develop a stable sense of self. They develop a role, and roles, when reinforced by institutions and community validation, can become more powerful than reality. Gypsy was not just told she was sick. She was rewarded for being sick. She was loved for being sick. She was protected for being sick. Her identity became inseparable from the performance of illness. To challenge it would not only risk conflict with her mother, it would risk the loss of attention, care, and social connection. For a child raised in isolation, that loss can feel existential. This is how dependency deepens. Not through chains, but through attachment. Dee Dee's control was effective not because it was always cruel, but because it was emotionally binding. The same person who restricted Gypsy's autonomy also provided her with affection, advocacy, and identity. That dual role, caregiver and captor, creates a psychological contradiction that is extremely difficult to untangle. It teaches a child that love and control are the same thing. That obedience is safety. That resistance is betrayal. By the time Gypsy recognized that she was not as ill as she had been told, the psychological damage was already embedded. Knowing the truth did not immediately create a path forward. It created confusion. If she was not sick, then who was she? If her mother had lied, then what else was false? If the foundation of her life was built on fabrication, then what could she trust? These are not abstract philosophical questions. For someone raised inside a constructed identity, they are destabilizing. They threaten the entire structure of self-understanding. This is where the fantasy world becomes more than escape. It becomes reconstruction. Online, Gypsy could rebuild herself piece by piece. She could experiment with personality, with romance, with desire, with autonomy. She could imagine a version of herself not defined by tubes, wheelchairs, or diagnoses, but imagination, when it becomes the only space of agency, carries danger. It is not moderated by real-world consequences. It is not tested by resistance. It does not require compromise. Fantasy offers control without friction, and in a life shaped by powerlessness, control can become intoxicating. Nicholas did not just offer emotional connection. He offered alignment. He believed her. He validated her experience. He did not question her desire to escape. In that validation, something hardened. The fantasy of leaving became the fantasy of removing the barrier. In this mental frame, Dee Dee was no longer only a mother. She became an obstacle, not a person, not a complex human being. An obstacle to freedom. This psychological shift is subtle but critical. When someone is reduced to an obstacle in the mind, empathy weakens. Moral complexity collapses. The person becomes a problem to be solved rather than a life to be considered. This is how violence becomes imaginable, not as cruelty, but as necessity. This is also where responsibility returns to the center of the story. Gypsy was abused. That is real. Gypsy also participated in planning a killing. That is also real. Both truths coexist. They are uncomfortable together, but separating them simplifies something that is inherently complex. In court, the narrative had to be narrowed. The law requires categories: victim, defendant, sentence, years. Psychology does not operate that cleanly. It recognizes gradients. It recognizes distortion. It recognizes how prolonged control can warp moral reasoning without erasing it. The sentence Gypsy received reflected this tension. It acknowledged the abuse. It acknowledged the crime. It placed her somewhere between victim and offender. For many observers, that middle space is difficult to accept. People want clarity. They want heroes and villains. They want stories that resolve emotionally. This one does not, because the damage did not begin with the murder, and it did not end with the sentence. The legacy of this case extends beyond the individuals directly involved. It raises questions about how medical systems verify long-term diagnoses, about how institutions track inconsistencies, about how communities respond to narratives that are emotionally compelling, about how often sympathy replaces scrutiny. Factitious disorder imposed on another is rare, but caregiver manipulation is not. And prolonged childhood control in many forms is more common than it appears. Most cases do not end in homicide, but many end in fractured identities, impaired autonomy, and lifelong psychological consequences. The difference here is visibility. This case forces society to look at what usually remains hidden. It forces recognition that abuse does not always look violent. Sometimes it looks devoted. Sometimes it looks protective. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice. And sometimes the very behaviors praised by outsiders are the mechanisms of control. What remains most haunting is not the crime itself, it is the years before it, the years where intervention might have changed the trajectory, the years where questions were asked and dismissed, the years where a child learned to perform suffering so convincingly that even she could no longer tell where performance ended and identity began. By the time the story reached its breaking point, the emotional architecture was already in place. This is why the case lingers. Not because of spectacle, but because of slow, quiet failure. Failure of systems. Failure of narrative skepticism. Failure to recognize that extreme caregiving can be a form of domination. And failure to understand how deeply control can shape a person's understanding of what is possible. Gypsy's life after incarceration continues to unfold in public view. Every interview, every relationship, Every new chapter becomes part of the ongoing attempt to define who she is outside the identity that was forced on her. That process is not linear. It is not clean. It does not erase the past. It exists alongside it. And perhaps that is the final truth of this story. That freedom, when it comes after lifelong control, does not arrive as peace. It arrives as complexity, as contradiction, as the slow, difficult work of learning how to be a person when personhood was never fully allowed. The story does not ask us to excuse what happened. It asks us to understand how it became possible. And in that understanding, it asks something more uncomfortable. To look at how often we accept stories that are easier to believe than the truth. To look at how silence can masquerade as kindness, and to recognize that some of the most devastating harm is done quietly, under the appearance of care. In the end, what remains is not a simple lesson. There is no single warning sign that could have guaranteed a different outcome. No single moment where everything could have been corrected if only someone had spoken louder, asked harder, insisted longer. What remains instead is a pattern where care became control, where sympathy became shelter for deception, where a child's identity was shaped by a story written by someone else, where silence was mistaken for safety. The tragedy is not only that a life was taken, the tragedy is that a life was constructed in such a way that violence became imaginable, not inevitable, but imaginable. This is where the deepest discomfort of the case lives, not in the act itself, but in the realization that the psychological conditions that made it possible were built slowly, quietly, and with the cooperation of systems that believed they were helping. Gypsy Rose Blanchard did not grow up learning how to leave. She grew up learning how to comply. She did not grow up learning how to challenge authority. She grew up learning that authority was love. She did not grow up learning that truth was stable. She grew up learning that truth could be changed if it served the story. When that is the emotional education of a child, escape does not look like a door. It looks like destruction. That does not make it right, but it makes it tragically comprehensible. Dee Dee Blanchard was not only an abuser, she was also a human being, flawed, controlling, damaging, capable of affection and harm at the same time. Reducing her to a villain makes the story easier, but it also makes it less useful, because it allows us to believe that abuse always looks monstrous. Often it looks devoted. Often it looks self-sacrificing. Often it looks like a parent who never leaves their child's side. The most dangerous control is not always enforced with anger. Sometimes it is enforced with care. Nicholas Gaudejon will spend his life in prison, not as a hero, not as a rescuer, but as a person who allowed fantasy to replace moral reality. His story is not one of sudden madness. It is one of isolation, emotional distortion, and the desire to be meaningful at any cost. And that cost was irreversible. Gypsy's story continues, not because it is resolved, but because it cannot be. She lives with two identities that cannot be separated: a child who was abused, and an adult who participated in a killing. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. Her life now exists in the shadow of a decision that cannot be undone, and a childhood that cannot be restored. That is not redemption. That is consequence. The legacy of this case is not closure. It is awareness. Awareness that systems can fail quietly, that narratives can become cages, that control does not always look like cruelty, and that silence, especially institutional silence, can be as destructive as overt violence. This was not a crime of passion. It was not an explosion. It was an exit. An exit shaped by years of containment, distortion, and emotional imprisonment. And in that, it leaves us with something heavier than shock. It leaves us with responsibility. Responsibility to question stories that feel too perfect. Responsibility to listen when details do not align. Responsibility to recognize that protection and possession are not the same thing. And responsibility to remember that children raised without agency may one day seek it in the most dangerous ways. This story does not end with justice. It ends with understanding. Not to excuse, but to prevent. not to simplify, but to recognize complexity. Because the most devastating crimes are not always loud. Sometimes they are built slowly, behind closed doors, under the appearance of care, and by the time the truth emerges, the damage has already been done. If you value stories that go beyond headlines, stories that examine not just what happened, but how and why, I invite you to stay with us here on Cold Case Chronicles. Your support helps us continue bringing these deep investigations to light, honoring victims by telling the full truth, not the easy version. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see something differently, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments. These conversations matter. Awareness matters. And remembering matters. Because some stories are not meant to be forgotten. They are meant to be understood.